Hey everyone, welcome. It is a little bit later than what I typically stream for, but I actually am in Baltimore tonight because I'm presenting at a conference tomorrow, so it took me a little bit of time to get down here from where I live. And so here we go. So tonight we're going to be talking about the federal budgeting process. This may be something that you've gotten to in your AP Gov class. Depends on if you're in a semester course or if you're in a year-long course and the unit order that your teacher does, or it may not be. But I can tell you, whether you've gotten to it or not, it is going to be something that is highly tested on the AP test. Often appears as an essay question or a part of an essay question on the AP test. And so it's something that you really do need to understand. And it's often just a concept that students really struggle with. So we're going to break down that tonight for you. Tonight we're going to cover these things. We're going to look at the budget cycle. We're going to talk about the Congress's role in the budget, who the actors are in the budget process, meaning who all is involved in that process, mandatory versus discretionary spending, the national debt, the debt ceiling, and borrowing. And these are all typically concepts that a lot of students struggle with. And so as we go tonight, if you have issues or you have questions on any things that I go over, then just hit me up and say, hey, I've got a question on this. That's why I'm here, okay? I'm basically your personal tutor for the next hour. So here we go. So I want to start by looking at a graph. If you don't know this already, maybe your teacher hasn't taught you this, or you haven't got to this yet, but one of your essay questions on the AP Gov exam in May will involve some sort of data analysis of a graph, okay? And so I like to, with my own students, utilize graphs as frequently as possible so that you get used to reading them. So I'm going to give you a minute here to take a look at this graph that I have up here. And I would like you just to type in the little chat box, what do you see when you look at this graph? I'm just curious to hear what people see when they look at this graph. If you'll just type it in the chat box, that would be great. Don't everybody type at once here. I think you meant inflation. Okay. So while a couple of you here are typing, some other things that I'll put out, how much federal outlays has risen? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So what you're looking at here is the amount of outlays is just federal spending. Okay. So when we look at 1945, okay, when they first started this graph at, and all the way, the most recent line in here is 2013 in this graph. I chose this graph because it was one of the ones that I liked the most, even though it's a couple years dated. It shows us the amount of federal spending every year. Okay, so we can make the general, what's the word I'm looking for? The general decision here that it's obvious there's a trend that the federal spending continues to go up as years go on. Okay, now there's kind of like this weird blip here. Okay, so when we look at FDR, okay, he's just parts because here's all the presidents, okay, and they're red and blue because it's Democrat and Republican. Why do you think FDR's is so much higher and then it shrinks? Because that's kind of like an abnormality in the graph. Why do you think that it is so high and then it shrinks for FDR? Thoughts? Yeah, okay, so you're correct. FDR was president during the Great Depression, but that's the 1930s. Okay, so if I went back, you would see it would be up too. Okay, this is 1945. This takes a little bit of historical background as well, too. Why is spending so high in the United States in 1945? Yeah, World War II. You're exactly right. Okay. So then the war ends, okay, and spending goes down. But then slowly it creeps up and keep creeping up. Okay, and we start to see it become really big during the presidency of Ronald Reagan, and then shooting still up here. Okay, now if I put historical events on here, some of this would make sense. During this whole time period, the 1950s all the way to the late 80s, that's the Cold War. So we're spending lots and lots and lots of money on military defense. During the presidency of George W. Bush, we're spending lots of money on the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Okay, but the general idea that I want you to get here is that government spending has increased and increased and increased every year, basically since I guess we could just say 1954. And really, I don't see that trend stopping. If I would put on here the rest of Obama's term, it would get a little bit higher each year. And if I put President Trump, it would be just a little bit higher than President Obama. Okay, so we definitely spend lots of money, and that's what we're going to be looking at in tonight's presentation. So the United States is required to have a budget. Okay, every year it has to have a budget. Okay, that's in the Constitution. It's a constitutional requirement. The federal government has to have a budget, and the Constitution is pretty specific about when different things should happen. Okay, so in February every year, okay, specifically the first Monday in February, the Constitution says, the president has to submit his budget request to Congress, okay? And basically what that is it usually is published in a big book, and in it, it lists all of the president's budget priorities for that year and how he would like Congress to spend their money. The president gets to recommend, but he's not the dictator, okay? He doesn't get the ultimate authority when it comes to the budget. Congress then gets to decide whether or not that's how they're going to spend their money. And guess what, friends? They never just decide to spend it exactly like the president wants it to be spent. Okay, and so what ends up happening is they tear that apart. If not, this whole process would be really easy. If all the president had to do was just send his budget to them and it'd be done, well, this would be a really quick process. But that's not what happens, especially when the president's of one political party and the majority of Congress is of another political party, what we call a divided government. And then to answer your question, the reason why it is on a Monday is just because it's the first workday of the week when Congress would meet. So then between February and April, the House and Senate both hold hearings in their committees, basically listening to people about why certain budgets should be increased or decreased, actually looking at the numbers and the expenditures and all that, and then are supposed to approve the budget by April 15th of every year. Okay, now that doesn't usually happen. And in fact, the entire budget being improved all together in one big swoop hasn't happened in my lifetime. And I'd have to go back and look the last year that happened. It's very, very, very rare. And so then between May and June, they start to prepare what are called appropriations bills. Anytime you see appropriations in government, that just means spending, okay? How we're going to spend money. Revenue means bringing in. Appropriation means pushing it out, okay? So in May to June, they prepare those bills, okay? And then those bills are typically passed throughout the summer, okay? Meanwhile, okay, the president is already getting ready for next year's budget in the summertime. They're sending out requests to all the departments, asking them, hey, what do you want in your budget this year? What are your goals this year and all that? And they're getting ready to start. The government's fiscal year, okay, the fiscal year is just the financial year, starts on October 1st of every year. So the government's actual financial year runs from October 1st to September 30th every year. Now, why is that? It's just because of the way that the government has set it up. Most companies' fiscal year is actually July 1st to June 30th of every year. Okay, but the federal government has it set up a little bit differently. And so that's the actual cycle of how the budget is passed. Now, what we're going to do is look at the actual reality of the situation and what actually happens there. So let's talk about what happens when that budget reaches Congress after the Yeah, the first Monday in February. Okay. The Constitution requires that Congress has to authorize all federal appropriations, meaning all spending. Okay. The president can ask for money for a certain project that he wants to have, but at the end of the day, if Congress doesn't approve that money, it's not happening. And I'll give you a perfect example of that currently that you've heard. So several months ago, and most of the beginning 2 years of President Trump's presidency, he's asked the Congress for, I want to say the number's $5 billion to build the wall on the border with Mexico and the United States. Okay. Well, Congress has heard that request, but they have denied it. Okay. In order for him to spend that money, Congress has to approve it. Okay. And thus far, Congress has not approved that money to build the wall. Okay. So that's an example of how the Constitution comes into play here. The president can want something, but if Congress doesn't want to pay for it, they don't have to pay for it. So what first happens in the budget process, you get two A bills. Okay, the first is called an authorization bill, and it's basically an act of Congress that establishes or changes a government program. So they specify the program goals and set out the maximum amount that they may spend. Okay, authorizations can be up for a year or run for a specified number of years. Okay, so this is the first part of some budgeted agency getting their money. So I'm just going to use the example of NASA, okay, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So the people that used to have the space shuttles, now we use a different program, but we study space. The International Space Station, you know, the people who have gone to the moon, the people that are planning to go to Mars, all those kind of things, okay? So what Congress does is, one of its things right now that NASA's planning is to go to Mars. And I think there used to be the date by like 2030 something, but I don't know if that's still the case or not. Okay. Congress has to authorize that program first before NASA can even think about spending any money on the preparations of sending people to Mars. Okay. Before they can even build the rocket, before they can even start studying it, Congress has to authorize that. And that's basically a way to prevent government agencies from just spending wherever they want to spend without actually getting any approval from Congress. Okay, so first thing that has to happen is the actual authorization bill, which basically says yes, this program is a go. Okay, then Congress has to pass an appropriations bill to fund the program that was established by the authorization bill. So if in the authorization bill they said, yeah, okay, we're okay with NASA going to Mars by whatever year, okay? But now they need to pass an appropriations bill to appropriate money, to set aside money to pay however many billion or trillion dollars, God only knows, it is going to cost to send someone to Mars, okay? Another example. So let's say that Congress authorizes expenditures for building highways, okay? Well, the authorization bill says, okay, we're going to set up the program, go build the highway. But they need the appropriations bill to follow it that says, here's the money that you can go and you can build that highway. So it's important to understand that in the budgeting process, first they have to authorize the program, then they have to appropriate the money for the program. So going back to what I was talking about a minute ago in that federal budget cycle, if I flip back for a second, so the president sends that giant budget to Congress, okay? I told you, the Congress never just approves the entire budget in its entirety. That does not happen. So what they do is they tear it apart. They might authorize department by department, or they might authorize specific programs within a department and then appropriate them. So basically think about the budget book being torn up into different pages, and they do different pages, and other pages they don't ever do at all, okay? So that's the first part that has to happen in Congress, okay? But that doesn't usually happen because that's the nice version of government, and this is now going to be the reality of government. So Congress doesn't often meet its own budgetary timetable, okay? There's just simply too much conflict. Even if the president and the Congress are of the same political party, typically there's a lot of conflict, and the budget just does not go smoothly through, okay? It just doesn't. And so when the president is of one party and Congress is of another party, it's even worse, okay? Especially when it comes to money, because if you think about congressmen are constantly searching for money specific to their district. Why do you think Congress is so interested in ensuring that money goes to their district. Yeah, exactly. So that they get reelected. Okay, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for basically for ways they can say, "Hey, I helped to build this bridge in your town, or helped to get money for this project the fire company was doing, or whatever." So that's a reason you should vote for me because I've gotten you this money. So Congress is looking out for themselves. The members of Congress are looking out for themselves when they go through this authorization and appropriation process because they want to send some of that money back to their districts. Okay. So instead, because there's so much dysfunction with the appropriations and authorization process, Congress will resort to what's called continuing resolutions, okay, which basically are laws that allow agencies to spend the previous year's level. So let's talk about NASA again, since that's the example that I've been using. So basically, if there's a lot of disagreement in Congress over that Mars program or whatever, and they cannot come up to conclude with an authorization and an appropriations bill, they just pass a continuing resolution, and it's basically saying continue to spend the same amount of money that you spent last year. Okay, and you're just going to keep using those program goals that we've given you last year until we authorize something new. Okay, so often now what actually happens is instead of actually passing the budget in part or whole, we pass continuing resolutions, and departments and agencies and all the different parts of government that you learn about in the bureaucracy just are funded on continuing resolutions, because if they don't get their funding, well, then they have to shut down. And we're going to talk about that here in just a couple minutes. So who all is involved in this budgetary process? Okay, there are about 8 different groups that I want to go over. The first are interest groups. Okay, and maybe you've talked about interest groups in your class, but these are just groups of people with similar interests or hobbies. And so examples would be like the National Rifle Association, the National Education Association, the American Association of Retired Persons. Those are all examples of really powerful interest groups. So no lobbyist that works for an interest group is worth his or her pay would ignore the budget. Okay, lobbying for groups' needs take place on the agencies with presidents before congressional committees. So the people that work for these interest groups that are lobbyists that go and actually try to convince the president and his staff and congressional members to make sure that X program is funded and Y program's not. Interest groups have a big role in this. Okay, so they go meet personally with the congressman or with presidential staff. They go to committee hearings about the budget and they testify, etc. Agencies also have a really big role in this. So the heads of government agencies almost always push for higher budgets. It would be incredibly rare for an agency to say, "Oh yeah, we don't want more money than last year," and it's unheard of for an agency to say, "Oh, we don't need as much money. You can reduce our budget." That's not unheard of. So agency heads all send their requests to the Office of Management and Budget, or the OMB. Now, this is a big one that's really important for you to understand. Okay, the Office of Management and Budget is part of the White House office. Okay. And works for the president. So because the president does not have the time to understand and make decisions about the billions and billions of dollars in the budget, they rely heavily on the staff of OMB. And as a result, they're major actors in the budget process. So the Office of Management and Budget is actually the group that puts the budget together for the president every year. Now, it doesn't mean that the president's not involved in that. The president certainly is. He sits down with the head of the OMB and he'll tell him, like, these are my priorities. These are the things I want to see funded this year. And then OMB will make sure that happens. But otherwise, all the nitty gritty details of the budget, which takes days and days and days and days and days and days and days to put together, the OMB actually handles. And then the president is the one who makes the final decision on what to actually propose to Congress. So when that draft of the budget's done, when OMB's put it together, they send it to the president, and the president goes through it line by line and basically says, yep, this is good, or no, this isn't. And then in February, he unveils the proposed budget, like I said, on the first Monday in February, and sends it to Congress. So then when it gets to the congressional side, these are the actors on their side. So tax committees in Congress have to look at it. The House Ways and Means Committee, which is the tax committee in the House, and the Senate Finance Committee all write tax codes, okay, which are subject to the approval of Congress. They have to be thinking about taxes because revenue is how you're going to get the money to spend to finance the budget. The Congressional Budget Office is another one, and it advises Congress on the probable consequences of its budget decisions. So how much money they might bring in because of a bill, or how much that bill is truly going to cost the Congress to pay for, okay? And so the CBO is a big part of it. The Appropriations Committees, which in both houses decide how to spend money, okay, and who gets what, play a major role in it. And then Congress as a whole, once the committees made their recommendations, has to decide on the taxes and the appropriations that are going to happen. The final piece here is the Government Accountability Office. And they're basically Congress's eyes and ears. They audit agencies and monitor and evaluate what agencies are actually doing with their budgets and are actually following the budgets as Congress has laid out for them. So those are your big actors in the budget process. Now, what I have here is the actual pie graph of the budget for 2018. Okay, but hold on here. I want to just check this question. These people in the question get chosen president in the White House. Okay, so this is a great question. So, do the people in the Congressional Budget Office get chosen when a new president is in the White House, or is there a different process? Yes and no. Okay. The yes side is the people that do get chosen when there's a new president in office is the Office of Management and Budget, because that is an actual White House office. So those are people that the president has hired to be a part of that process. Okay. Now, the Congressional Budget Office is the separate issue. Okay. Those are not hired by the president. They are part of the legislative branch. Okay. The Congressional Budget Office and the Government Accountability Office are both nonpartisan offices, meaning they don't side with one political party or another. Their job is to do the work that's been set aside for them. So like the Congressional Budget Office, whether you're Republican or Democrat, they're going to give you the same opinion. Basically, this is what the consequences are of your bill. This is how much your bill is going to cost the government. This is how much we project you're going to end up spending on it, etc. That's what they do. They don't issue a political decision. Okay, so the Office of Management and Budget is appointed by the president, but the Congressional Budget Office is not. But unlike the Office of Management and Budget, which definitely can be politically motivated, the Congressional Budget Office is not. Does that answer your question? Okay, great. Okay, so going back to this chart. So this is last year's budget because I wanted to pull a year back to get some good data here. So let's just look at the blue side here, okay? Outlays is just another word for spending, okay? Where does the United States government, looking at this, spend most of its money? What are things that you see that we're spending most of our money on? Yep, Social Security is huge. Any other ones that pop out? Defense, yeah, good. So there are two types of spending that are happening here, okay? Anything that's in this like grayish to dark blue color, this is what is called mandatory spending, okay? What mandatory spending is spending that the government must spend every year. Okay, they absolutely have to spend that money because it's required by them in law. So every year they must spend. In 2018, it was $982 billion. They had to spend by law to give Social Security benefits to those who were 65 years of age or older. In 2018, they had to spend $582 billion to give Medicare benefits to those who are 65 years of age and older. They had to spend $389 billion in Medicaid benefits for those who are below a certain income level, okay? And then there's some other things in there like military retirements, unemployment, compensation, things like that. Those are things that the federal government cannot control. They could not cut these things down if they wanted to, okay? They can't because they're required by the law. So those things, more than half of the budget, okay, $2.5 trillion is already set every year. Whether or not, and these numbers go up, by the way, because, more people age, et cetera, and they become eligible for Social Security and Medicare, whatever. But this is money they can't touch. So over 50% of their budget, it's already determined for them, okay? Then here's another little chunk, okay? $325 billion is also already mandated for them because it's the interest payment on the debts. Because we have so many $1 trillion debt, and basically we're just paying the interest payments on it because we couldn't pay the whole thing off right now if we wanted to. So that's mandated. So then what's left, this small piece of the pie here, is what we call discretionary spending. And that's the budget process that we just talked to. That's where they get to decide what things they're going to spend money on and how much they're going to spend that money on. Okay, so it's a small piece, about right around 40% of the budget is actually stuff they can decide on. All this over this mandatory spending, nope, you cannot decide on it. Discretionary spending, it's at their discretion. They can decide on it. Okay, so of the discretionary spending, over 51% of the discretionary spending goes to defense. Okay, so we spend more on defense than any other country in the world, and we outspend them by huge amounts. Now, what's the other discretionary spending? Well, I'm going to flip forward here. This is the other discretionary spending in the 2019 budget for President Trump. So, like I said, 61% of it went to military. Okay. Then we start to break it down into the other things. Veterans benefits was a big category. Education's always a big category. Just the functioning of the government in general. And then you could keep going around here. Okay. But when they're making the budget, these are the things. The discretionary spending are the things that they're looking at. Okay, so like if we go back to the space program, the category the space program would be in is like science, which only makes up 2% of discretionary spending. Okay, not even of the entire budget. Okay, so we have to consider when we look at the budget that there's a huge chunk of mandatory spending, which they don't have any choice but to spend that money. This is the only piece of the budget that they actually have discretion to choose on. Okay. Do you have any questions on mandatory versus discretionary spending before I move on here? Because sometimes that gets a little bit confusing for people. Okay, I'll keep watching the chat box there just to see if anybody else has anything. Otherwise, I want to talk about the other side of this. Okay, so the other side of this is this revenue. Okay, so the money we're bringing in. So here's what we're spending. Here's what we're bringing in. Okay. Okay, so we're spending in 2018 we're bringing in $3.3 trillion. We're spending $4.1 trillion. That means that we're spending more money than what we're bringing in. So we're incurring debt as a result. So where does our revenue come from? Okay, income tax is almost 50% of where it comes from. The tax that you and I actually get taken out of our paychecks for our income. Okay, that goes to government. The other big piece are payroll taxes, and this is also comes out of your income, your checks from your employer, and these are for things like Social Security, Medicare, and healthcare programs. Okay, those are things that if you're confused on Social Security, healthcare policy, et cetera, I just did a big cast last night on those. You can check it out in the archives because I went into all of that. Okay, but what I want you to get here in this budget one is that we spend more than we bring in. And that is a problem. That's how we get that debt that I showed you at the very beginning that keeps going up every year because we keep spending more and more than we're bringing in. So that's kind of a problem. So with that said, let's talk about the national debt, okay? So the government gains debt when we spend more than we actually bring in revenue, okay? A budget is actually balanced when spending and revenue are equal. Okay, so in order for this budget that you just saw to have been balanced, okay, we could not have spent more than we brought in. So if we only brought in 3.3 trillion in 2018, we'd have to cut this budget by almost $1 trillion to make it balanced because this would have to be 3.3 trillion. Okay, and if you look at that, That's going to be pretty hard when you consider the mandatory spending of the 3.3 trillion. It would be 2.5 of it would be in mandatory spending. Okay, so the last time that the budget was actually balanced for a couple years was under President Clinton in the 1990s. Okay, and we started paying off the debt when that happened because we weren't spending more than we were bringing in. But then when George W. Bush came into office, we went right back into going back into debt. We're spending more than we're bringing in. Barack Obama continued that trend, and Donald Trump has also continued that trend. By law, though, the Congress is only allowed to borrow so much money in order to pay for their expenses. That's what's called the debt ceiling. So there's literally a number. Okay, it's so many $1 trillion right now. That's the debt ceiling, and Congress cannot borrow more than that. Okay, to do so, they have to increase it, and to do that, they have to change the law. Okay, so we do increase the debt ceiling throughout history. If not, well, we'd be in big trouble. Okay, and usually when the debt ceiling increase comes up, which is almost once a year, there are major political fights. Okay, because the opposite party says, well, we're not going to pass this unless you do X, Y, and Z. And so last year, when this occurred, it would have been in the spring of last year when it was time for the debt ceiling to increase. The president basically said, I'm not signing any debt ceiling increase unless you give me the money for a border wall. And the Democrats said, we're not doing it. Okay. So what happens then if they don't increase the debt ceiling and all of a sudden the Department of Treasury can't borrow money anymore? Well, when they can't borrow money anymore, the government has to shut down. Okay. So literally on whatever day they hit the debt ceiling, the government shuts down. All non-essential employees can no longer work. Okay. So literally, if you live near Washington, D.C., it's like the city goes silent. Okay. All the museums close down because they're government funded, like the Smithsonian and things like that. Government employees can't go to work unless you're an essential employee. Okay. Which is a few and far between. And during that time, when the government shuts down, if you're a federal government employee, whether you work for them in Washington, D.C., or you work for them, in a Social Security office somewhere across the country, doesn't matter. You don't get paid, okay, for that entire time. Now, they will back pay you once the shutdown is over, but during that shutdown time, they will not pay you, okay? So the last shutdown last year lasted for over a month before the president finally gave in and signed it without his spending for the border wall, okay? So that's what has to happen. So government shutdowns occur. They used to be pretty rare, and unfortunately, they're becoming more and more frequent as politics in Washington, D.C. seems to become more and more dysfunctional. And that's not really good because our creditors, the people that basically rate how good our credit is, meaning how likely we are to pay back our debt, they threaten to decrease that credit rating, which is not good when we do things like not increasing the debt ceiling. Okay, so how do we get money to pay for the programs when we don't have a balanced budget? Okay, because like I said, we're not bringing in as much as we're spending. Well, we borrow that money. And the chief way that we borrow money is by selling government bonds. Okay. So what's a bond? Well, it's literally just a fancy piece of paper that says, I'm buying this bond. I'm just going to use a really simple number here. I'm buying a government bond for $10. Okay. And the government says, well, you can turn in that $10 bond in 10 years from now, and we'll give you back your $10 plus whatever the interest rate is, 10% interest rate on top of that. So people will buy bonds because they trust the government's good for their debt, okay? And 10 years from now, or if they keep them longer than that, they keep getting more and more interest. They'll turn that bond in and get the interest on it. So they make money on it. So the biggest buyers of our government bonds or our government debt, because that's really what it is, are foreign countries, China being the big one. Now, often on television, you'll hear newscasters say about, like, oh my God, like the Chinese own huge portions of our debt. We can't do this. Like, it's just too much. And people start to freak out because if they say if China calls in its debt, we can't pay it off, and that will collapse the economy. Well, they're not wrong. If China would call in its debt, it would collapse the economy. But China's not going to do that, okay? Nor is any other foreign country. And the reason is because if they did that, it would collapse our economy, and it would collapse the Chinese economy right with it. Because we're so interconnected now because of globalization that all of the other countries in the world would be affected because we have literally the strongest economy on the planet. And so that's something to keep in mind. Okay, so you can't worry about the national debt per se when it comes to bonds. Now, is our national debt a problem? Yeah, I'm not just going to sit here and say it's not a problem. It certainly is a problem. Okay, but I'm not losing sleep at night thinking that the Chinese are going to call it in and the whole economy is going to crash. So when you hear that type of rhetoric on television, think back to this cast and what we talk about and the fact that it's really not going to happen like that. Okay. So when we look at federal debt and what has happened here with federal debt, okay, it's really high during FDR's presidency. Again, this is all World War II. Harry Truman comes in at the end of World War II, and then it starts to decrease. And we start to see a downhill decrease until we get to President Reagan in the 1980s. Now, this is going to take some historical knowledge here, but does anybody know why does the debt increase so much during Reagan in the 1980s? I see Reaganomics, but be more specific. You're right. I agree with you, but what do you mean by that? Yeah, exactly. Okay, so with Reaganomics, Ronald Reagan used supply side economics, which if you're not sure what that is, don't worry. I've got a stream coming up next week. I'll break it down for you. And so we cut taxes, but we didn't cut spending. So we basically said, okay, well, we're not going to get as much revenue as the government anymore, but we're going to increase how much we spend. Okay, what do you think Ronald Reagan was spending a lot of money on? Anyone have a guess? Yeah, defense, military. Okay. Ronald Reagan was increasing the military budget pretty big. Okay. So you see that increase, and then Ronald Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, becomes president for 4 years. He continues to increase it, but largely because we go to war in the Persian Gulf War. And then President Clinton comes in, and that budget starts to go down. That deficit starts to go down. Why does the deficit or the debt go down? Because he's balancing the budget. Then George W. Bush comes in, and it starts to raise again. Okay, same with Barack Obama. George W. Bush is because of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Okay, so can we cut spending? Yes. Would it be hard? Yes. Okay. Eventually, though, we're going to have to do something. Okay, we just can't keep going trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars in debt and not worry about it. It definitely is something that the federal government has to look at. So that's it for the debt. Does anyone have any questions on the budget, on the debt, on the way that it works? I want to make sure I get any kind of questions here tonight before I sign off for the week. Okay, well, then the streams are all up here for everything that's coming up this next coming week. Hopefully, we'll see you guys in some of those. Otherwise, have a great night, guys. See ya.